Welcome. My name is Alexandros. I am the founding coordinator for the academic project IDSP, i.e. Dissertation Support Project. And let me share my screen to show you my slides. So, as you can see, this is our second session for our IDSP Competition 2020 data analysis demos. And I'm speaking from London on the 27th of August 2020. You can see here the logo of our project and the logo of our competition. You can find us also on social media using the IDSP IOE handle on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and using our name IDSP IE Dissertation Support Project on LinkedIn, YouTube, Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft Stream, and the hashtag IDSP20C for our competition, and the hashtag IDSP20CDAD2 for our data analysis demos. Today, we're pleased to continue our data analysis demo sessions, DAD, on our IDSP Microsoft Teams team. These sessions include dissertation research data analysis, practical demonstrations by competitors of our IDSP Competition 2020 for postgraduate taught dissertations and questions by our team members. We are also considering accepting guest sessions, so even from alumni or PhD students or master students that have not taken part in our competition as competitors, but are interested in presenting their own research. So they are not our main presenters for these sessions, but we're calling them guest presenters. So if you're interested, you can send us a message. In our second session, IDSP20CDAD2, we are hearing from an IDSP20C distinguished competitor, Hannah, who managed to accumulate the highest number of points for our preliminary stage, building on their previous week's demo. Let me now briefly introduce Hannah. So Hannah Scott is our presenter for this data analysis demo and competitor in our competition. She is currently studying a Master of Science in Social Policy and Social Research at UCL IOE and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Children, Young People and Families. Hannah has previously worked in specialist education provision, has held research assistant positions, and is after a PhD study and academic career, which is very challenging, but also rewarding. Hannah is currently investigating university students' lived experiences of Class A drug taking and perspectives of personal, social, health, and economic drug education. Hannah is presenting on the use of multiple qualitative methods which are used in a dissertation, and following the previous week's two approaches to thematic analysis, the standard one and ideographic approach, today's focus is on qualitative content analysis and between method triangulation. So, warm welcome to Hannah. And finally, administration gratitude and wishes. Attendance is open to all our Microsoft team members that can also ask questions in the meeting chat. We're extending our warm gratitude and wishes to our presenter and participants. The data analysis demo sessions are recorded and can be watched later in our general channel and social media mentioned at the beginning. A reminder that the third session is provisionally scheduled for next Thursday, 3rd of September, 8 to 8:20, with two available 10-minute slots in the same channel, and we're accepting requests. as we said, not only from competitors, but also other students in education, psychology, or social science. Finally, wishing a fruitful session, I'm turning the floor over to Hannah for this promising session. So, Hannah, until I open the slides, you can start introducing.
Hi, good morning. So this is the second of my presentations, and this follows on somewhat from the presentation I gave last week. So within my dissertation, I've used multiple qualitative methods and used between method triangulation to bring together the findings from each of the different methods that we used. So last week I presented on a ideographic case study approach to thematic analysis and a more standard approach to thematic analysis. And this morning I'll be presenting on qualitative content analysis and between method triangulation.
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It seems that there was an issue with the network, but now it should be okay. Can you see the slide now?
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay.
Yeah, so having presented last week on 2 different approaches to thematic analysis, this week I'll be presenting on 2 different, on qualitative content analysis and between method triangulation. If we go on to the next slide as well. So qualitative content analysis, the next slide, please. The approach to qualitative content analysis that I took was outlined as a 12-step process. So pursuing a specific problem to be investigated, becoming familiar with the process and the context of the source of the information and the sources of the different possible sources of information, becoming familiar with examples of the relevant document and selecting a unit of analysis. So in this case, a unit of analysis is a full document. So for this study, it was different, each individual sample resource that I was able to use, or each individual sort of website that students recommended that they were using was considered as a separate unit of analysis. The 4th step is to list several codes or categories to guide the data collection and draft a protocol. So the codes and categories for this were primarily formulated beforehand after having already conducted interviews and started looking at Reddit posts and starting to analyse them. I used the codes and categories that I come up with through the thematic analysis of both of those sources to then guide my how I drafted my protocol for this. I then tested the protocol by collecting data from a couple of the different sources, and then made sure that actually it was collecting the sort of data that I was looking for and making sure it covered everything. And then once that the protocol was finalized, I then went through and made sure that my sampling sort of strategy for the sources that I was selecting was robust and it made sense. After I selected all the units of analysis that I was going to use and had fully drafted a finalized protocol, I then performed the data analysis and coded the data using the protocol. And then once that you've collected data with the protocols, you can then compare and contrast from how you've analysed the data using the protocols to compare and contrast extremes or similarities between each of the units of analysis. Protocols can be quite useful because as part of it you can include a brief summary, so you can have each source summarised alongside the analysis, so it can make it easy to be able to quickly compare and contrast sources from just your quick summaries, so you can then look more in depth at the actual individual elements of the protocol to compare and contrast. And then integrating findings with your interpretations and key concepts is the final step to qualitative content analysis. So this is the protocol that I use. So obviously it depends on the documents that you're analysing or the content that you're analysing. So for me, because I was using primarily curriculum sample resources, I was looking for the sort of title of the resource, the author. So what perspective was it going to be coming from? Was it from an independent charity, or was it from something that was government aligned? The sort of date it had been produced to sort of ascertain the relevance of it, the main topic of it, if there were any sources or references included within it, what language was used to talk about drugs. Was it positive, negative, or neutral? And then in terms of prevention education, was the focus on knowledge, skills, or harm reduction or abstinence? And then a summary at the end. So this was one of the sample resources for PSHE education provided by the the Winter Project. So here was the scheme of work for Year 7 for legal and illegal drugs. So to analyse that, you work through your protocol, analysing it, highlighting key themes or codes that will emerge that match up with the protocol that you're using to drive your investigation. So the next slide. So here we can see basic facts, substances and the risks of misusing, managing risks and making safer choices about healthy lifestyles, and then identifying a range of legal and illegal drugs, or to know about a range, to have some understanding of the effects and risks, to understand the risks again, to know what effect cannabis will have on someone's health and life, legal consequences, and to resist pressures, and to understand the risks of volatile substances again, and then again to resist pressure and how to get and give help. And then included in sort of the lesson title, so one's looking at substance abuse, and then in terms of resources, drug fact cards, peer pressure strategies, and other pressure scenarios. So this is the Year 7 sample scheme of work from the Christopher Winter project. There weren't any references included within it, but the title was Legal and Illegal Drugs. The language used to talk about drugs here is generally quite neutral. It's not sort of necessarily saying that drugs are bad. It's not necessarily saying drugs are good. It does err on the negative side a bit, because sort of risks have some sort of connotation of negativity. So it suggests it is sort of slightly more negative, but mainly it's neutral. In terms of prevention education, it's primarily promoting knowledge, sort of words such as facts, sort of to know, drug fact cards. It's suggesting that it's primarily a knowledge-based curriculum. However, the fact that they've included pressure scenarios does suggest that there are some sort of skills education being included within the curriculum. Could we go back to the previous slide, sorry? Thank you. So yes, the sort of fact that they've included peer pressure scenarios does suggest that actually there is some skill-based education included within the curriculum as well. And then, although there is some things in there that again suggest sort of get and give help, suggest that there's some level of harm reduction being taught, but sort of healthy lifestyles, making safer choices, does suggest that this is primarily an abstinence-based approach. So as a key summary, we can say it's a knowledge focus, but pressure scenarios suggest skills. Get and give help suggests some harm reduction, while safer choices about healthy lifestyles suggest abstinence. Primarily uses neutral languages, but risks and consequences have more negative connotations. So between method triangulation is a type of triangulation that's particularly useful when your sources start at different levels. So the purpose of triangulation is to provide deeper insights to answer a research question, and it also increases the validity and credibility of findings, because you're showing that you're getting the same answer or the same things coming from multiple different perspectives or multiple different sources, or depending on the type of triangulation being used, even multiple different researchers. So between method triangulation is particularly useful here because different methodological approaches were being used that started at different levels. So interviews obviously start at a verbal level, and although they've been transcribed, verbal interviews are a different level to the analysis of print documents. So here, sort of, it's important to sort of be able to identify which sources help answer which questions. So here, PSHE guidance and other sources that students turn to for education can help answer my research questions of where do students access knowledge and support regarding Class A drug taking, and how does PSHE drug education influence students' Class A drug taking behaviour? Whereas the qualitative interviews can help answer what factors contribute to university students' decisions to take Class A drugs, and where do students access knowledge and support regarding Class A drug taking, and how does PSHE drug education influence students' Class A drug taking behaviours? And finally, the Reddit discussion boards can answer what factors contribute to university students' decisions to take Class A drugs, and where do students access knowledge and support regarding Class A drug taking. So to look specifically at the question of how does PSHE drug education influence students' Class A drug taking behaviours, The sources that were useful for answering that were the qualitative interviews and the PSHE guidance and other sources that students turn to for education. So the key findings from the qualitative interviews that we discussed last time were that intra-university users thought it was helpful at the time as a deterrent but not relevant to them, whereas pre-university users didn't feel it was helpful as it only focused on deterring drug use. All students kind of remembered PSHE being primarily a fact-based approach, and it focused on the negatives of drugs, kind of if you do drugs, you'll die. With the PSHE guidance, the government guidance promotes a fact-based approach with a focus on the negatives of drugs, so the risks and consequences. The curriculum materials do tend to be slightly more neutral, but the curriculum suggests there is skill-based components that may be incorporated as well as knowledge, and there is some mention of harm reduction. So from this we can see that it's very much focused, PSHE is very much focused on knowledge, and that is the main thing that students are taking away from this. Even if there are skill-based components included, students don't seem to be taking that away, and that doesn't seem to be informing their drug-taking behaviour. But it could also suggest that when you look at the existing literature, there have been sort of issues mentioned with the previous non-statutory status of PSHE education, in that it doesn't often receive the time and funding that other statutory subjects do. So it could suggest that actually, depending on school and level of funding, different schools may be incorporating different elements into their teaching because there is no central curriculum for PSHE, only recommended resources to be used. Similarly, we can see that in the guidance that there's some mention of harm reduction, and that was something that students didn't think was particularly helpful about the fact that it didn't seem to be mentioned when they were taught it, and that was something they were often advocating for. So this suggests that actually having some focus on harm reduction would be beneficial as well. But it shows overall that the PSHE drug education doesn't tend to have a huge impact in its current form on students' Class A drug-taking behaviours, at least once they get to university. Okay. Thank you for listening to my presentation this morning, and you can find my references here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah, for the presentation. So now, in terms of, let's say, short Q&A session, how you chose this approach in terms of your data analysis? So you chose to use a triangulation, you chose the specific analysis method. Was this a decision that you took mostly by researching online, by following that supervisor advice, by previous experience? Which of the, or combination of all this?
So a bit of a combination. I'd initially planned to just use qualitative interviews, but due to the pandemic, I wasn't actually able to get very many participants. So my supervisor suggested that actually it might be more useful to also include other sources to be able to provide a broader picture. At which point I looked at different ways that I could triangulate different data, read up a lot more about different methods of triangulation, and also other sources that I could use. So my supervisor had suggested that analysing qualitatively content analysing documents would be useful, but I also suggested Reddit, the thematic analysis of the Reddit post, because Reddit was a source that a number of participants highlighted as something they often used to get knowledge and advice. So kind of having sort of read through my interviews, looked at the sources they were using, and also on the advice of my supervisor, I searched for different sources that showed sort of different perspectives. So I could see the student perspective through my interviews. I could see the sort of information that they were getting through Reddit and the perspective of young people on Reddit. And I could also see sort of the different perspectives that were coming through. So from the government guidance, I could get the perspective of the Department of Education, and through the PSHE resources that have been produced by charities, they're recommended by the government. So we can see what charities that the government recommends are promoting. Then also there were other charities that were more independent that participants recommended that they use to get more information about drugs. So I also use their perspective, and those charities tend to promote a much more harm reduction approach and don't take an all-out sort of abstinence approach, which again provides a different perspective, because if that's the information that students are sort of deferring to, that will be the approach that they take to drugs.
Yes, it seems that it was a strategic decision. So Professor Sandy Olive seems to guide you very well, so you can learn more, many things out of your cooperation. Are you thinking of continuing with her in a doctoral level or another supervisor?
At sort of doctoral level, I've been looking at investigating the impact of fitness to study policies, because a lot of universities introduced fitness to study policies, but the sort of stories that have been printed in student-led publications, so sort of university newspapers, suggest that actually students aren't very happy with the policies, and the policies sometimes have a sort of paradoxical impact, because they're supposed to be there to support students, but there have been sort of reports from students saying, actually, this policy was much more detrimental to me than supportive. And so there's not been a sort of huge review of the guidance, but there's been a couple of universities that have looked back at their guidance for fitness to study and have said, actually, we've listened to students and we do agree it could be detrimental. So I want to kind of look at the impact that these policies actually have in terms of sort of students' help-seeking behaviours, and whether or not they are actually supporting students, or if they're having a detrimental impact, and how these policies can be reformed to better support students.
So as for the data that you analyzed, which one you found most interesting to look more into it?
I think the interviews were the most interesting ones that I'd kind of, if I'd had sort of a bit more time, that I would have liked to have gone back and explored more, especially sort of being able to go back more and ask participants more questions as well, because there were some very interesting things that come up, and also it would have been much more interesting if I'd have had more participants as well to be able to explore whether or not this was, a lot of the things that were coming up were similar for other students too. So obviously the sort of students that took drugs before university had very similar experiences, and the students that didn't take drugs until they got to university also had similar experiences. So had I been able to get more participants, it would have been interesting to see if that was still the case with a larger sample.
So, to keep the session no longer, since we already had the delays, again, technical issues seems to reoccur. So, but we are persistent. We are not affected negatively out of this. So we keep trying and giving our best out to share our perspectives, our research, our impressions. It's a panel arena, let's say, to share and learn from each other. And we are hoping that this is going to continue for the rest session. Maybe for the next weeks it will be difficult due to the submission of the dissertations, but we can resume even after. So we're inviting you also formally to continue when you are ready with the new sessions. You can judge which would be most useful for us to hear and for you to present. And we are deeply grateful for today, and conclude the session by looking forward to our next one. All the best.
Thank you.